the context for what we're doing here is that there really is an increasing threat of GM in UK food and farming. So that's happening due to a lot of, lots of different stuff coming together. We've got Brexit, we've got technological innovation in that we've got more new forms of GM becoming available, and there's been a really big push to promote those. If you were in any doubt about the context and the threat, DEFRA, the UK government's Environment Department, launched last week a consultation that is very clearly and very openly framed as, we want to deregulate gene editing, which is the newest form of GM, and we've got some questions for you about the fine detail of how it's done. They're not even pretending that they haven't already decided that they want to deregulate. So, we're in a very high pressure, high focus situation. The spin and the communications promoting GM they've been increasingly effective for years and years, and there's some extraordinary claims in that consultation document for a start. So, the messages that are reaching most people are very pro-GM, with lots of different phrases that we hear all the time. The project that this workshop is reflecting is called We've Been Framed, and thanks to funding from the Network for Social Change, GM Freeze has been able to develop this project. We worked with Ralph and we ran a workshop with a number of stakeholders from quite different kinds of organisations, and that was the process that Pat mentioned. We're going to be producing a messaging guide at the end of that project. Apologies to anybody who read the promotion that I had to write quite some time ago and came expecting to pick up their guide and walk away. It is still in progress for various reasons, not least that consultation coming out very suddenly. But actually that's even better, because it means you're contributing to it. What happens today will contribute to that guide. And we've got a page up on our website already at gmfreeze.org/framed, where that's where we'll publish it, and there's lots of there'll be lots of materials there in time. I think we've had quite a lot going on in the chat while I was gabbing away there. Ralph, do you want to explore any of that, or do you want to move straight on and explain a little bit about framing to everybody?
I think I'll just move on. I think it was just to get everyone in the headspace that what we're talking about in terms of communication is associations people have in their mind. So it's quite a good kicking off spot for me. So I don't mind just going from here, if that's okay. Right. I'll just pull up my slides for everyone. Hello, if you've only just joined, I'm Ralph from Framing Matters. And I've moved to a two-screen system, so I've slightly confused myself. Am I screen sharing now? Is that all working? Excellent. So we're going to just talk a little bit about a project that I've been doing with GM Freeze and a lot of associated organisations. We did 3 different workshops, and as Liz has said, it's going to feed into a toolkit on genetically, on how to talk about GM specifically. So just really quickly, Framing Matters. One of the things that's slightly different about the approach that I have that's different to some other communications is that it's a lot about social psychology and cognitive linguistics. So there's 2 things that I concentrate on quite a lot. One is what's already in people's heads. So it's not a deficit model of seeing just what you want to say and pouring it into someone's empty brain. It's more about understanding how they understand an issue as you start to communicate, because how someone already understands the words you're using or the images you're using is really important to how they'll actually respond. And the second thing that's really important to me is unintended consequences. Often when we're trying to do good, we can do accidental harm if we don't understand quite what the impacts of our communications are. So I always have these 2 things in mind. I wanted to start off really quickly, just so we're all on the same page about what framing is. If people have an idea about what framing is, maybe you could chuck it in the chat, say what you think framing is. There are probably no wrong answers, and it's probably going to touch a lot of the things that you're talking about. To give one example, that George Lakoff, who's a linguist from America, who's worked extensively with the Democrats, talks about is he basically used the example of a school or of a hospital. So if I say school, what comes to people's minds? Again, you can chuck it in the chat if you want. So just doing that free association, if I said to you school, what's the first thing that came into your mind? Fish. Okay, that's interesting. Or maybe that was something else. Prison, education, classroom, pupils, students, right? So there are a lot of things that come to mind just from a single word, right? And these can just be as simple as teachers, students, being bored, homework. They could be more ephemeral or more interesting things like a school bell or the certain smells or things you associate with school. But what Lakoff says is a really important element of this is that when I say school, you know that they're teachers and they're students and you know their roles, right? So by using a single word, I can imply and in some way validate the idea of hierarchy, okay? So you're bringing to mind a worldview when you talk about school. If I said, oh, my new work is very much like school, then people would know what you're talking about, that it's strict or authoritarian or whatever. So the idea about framing is that it can bring associations to your mind, and they might not be associations that you necessarily agree with, but they change your response and they change your thinking, okay? Lakoff's written a load of books. One of the most famous ones, Don't Think of an Elephant. But one other thing he says is basically our common sense is just the stuff that we hear most often repeated, okay? So we hear something so often that we understand it to be true. And a lot of us think of ourselves as being like rational humans, especially people who work in sort of science related or policy related areas. We think of ourselves as very rational beings. But in fact, a lot of the things that we take as being knowledge or take as social norms are just things that we've repeatedly heard rather than things that are grounded in any sort of evidence. So I also wanted to draw your attention to sort of all words bring to mind associations, right? But these can be very broad. There are some terms that are repeated enough, often in the mass media, that they bring to mind very, very strong associations with a small group of things. Okay, so they bring to mind a worldview. So if I was to say state, that's a very broad frame or message. It could mean loads of things. I could be talking about a state of panic, a state of confusion. I could be talking about gas, solid, liquid. I could be talking about Hawaii, Alaska, right? It could be loads of different things. And likewise, if I bring up government, okay, that could bring out a load of negative and positive associations, right? What the role of government is and isn't. I just wanted to point out sort of strong terms, right? If I say nanny state, that brings to mind a really strong worldview about how the authoritarian government are getting in your stuff, right, and stopping you doing things, right? And I think one of the things I find so fascinating is that hardly anyone on this call would have ever had nanny state explained to them, right? It's just something they've heard many, many times. And then they understand that worldview. They don't necessarily agree with it. But the thing that's really amazing about that is like how many people have actually had a nanny? It must be like 0.001% of our whole population. Somehow that's become a thing, a describer that everyone understands for someone that's like trying to mollycoddle you, even though people haven't had direct experience of it. And likewise in America, the idea of big government, right? If I say big government, it's a much stronger frame in terms of drawing together a specific worldview than just government on its own. It's talking about a bloated like inefficiency. It's a sort of neoliberal term where the private sector is sleek and powerful and gets things done, and government is bloated and like unable to do stuff, right? So frames can be like very powerful and focused, or they can be very broad, right? And so I think often we're chasing things that are quite focused, that they attach to a certain story. And so often I work with groups and they want like a new term or a new thing. You know, we want to talk about this new, but actually the most effective communication is pulling on stories that already exist in your head, right? It's about tapping into things you already know, narratives you already know, metaphors you already know. So one good example of that is the Robin Hood tax, right? I don't have to explain to you what it means, but you'll already know, right, from saying that, because you've got the story in your head. So we're not always going for something shiny, we're going for something that actually resonates with people. And can't get away with not talking about Dominic Cummings, obsessed with him. This one example, I don't know if anyone's seen the film thing that makes him into like amazing hero, played by Dominic, is it Dominic Cumberbatch? No, Benedict Cumberbatch. I'm getting my people confused. Benedict Cumberbatch. And I don't know if it's apocryphal or if it's actually true, but there's this bit where he writes on the whiteboard, take control, right? And then he goes off for like 3 months and he goes down the pub and talks to every man and like talks to everyone. And then he's suddenly like, yes, I've got it. And he runs back and he puts back in the middle, right? And actually this is incredibly integral to how this worked. And the same thing for the horrendous Make America Great Again, right? It was about harking back. And what's really interesting about this, the associations, like taking control is a scary prospect, right? You're on a plane and someone's like, can someone take control? You're like, oh my God, or take control of the situation. No one wants to be there, right? But if you had something taken from you, that's very different, right? So the idea of reclaiming something that was yours is really important. And just to tell you one quick study that really iterates the importance of this. So there's a study in which they gave, they had loads of groups of people and they gave one person 90 quid and the other person 110 quid, right? And then about 5 minutes later, they took the 10 quid off the person who had 110 quid and gave it to the person who had 90. So both people had 90 quid. So 100 quid, right? My maths is brilliant today. So basically, both people were given £100, right? But one was given £110 and had it taken away from them. Actually, they found that the person who had the money taken away from them felt really aggrieved, even though they'd just made 100 quid, right? So even though they'd only got it minutes ago, the feeling of loss was still there, right? So the feeling of loss is a really important driving element in this like narrative. So it's really important in terms of this slogan. That's one of the things that really made it work, because it was talking about something that used to be yours that you should have back. It was also problematic in a large number of ways, but we won't go into those. So I just want to talk about the fact that GM Freeze are doing this new guide, which is really exciting. I've done a few toolkits in the past. So one of the first ones I did was Common Cause for Nature, and that was looking at values primarily and had a bit of framing analysis in it. But I've sort of moved forward from there now, and I'm focusing just on framing. That was done with a PIRC, not with Frame Matters. I had another quick question for you, which is if people could put in the chat some what they think are strong frames. So things like take back control, or I don't know, Ramonas, or anything they think which is a very short message which conveys, or nanny state, we saw an example, or big government. Some examples that you've seen that you think are very good messages that are putting forward a worldview, not necessarily one you agree with at all, but one that is very strong. And also, if you don't want to contribute in the chat, I really encourage you just to write on a pen and paper. Like it's really important to give yourself a chance to think through some of these ideas rather than just like listen to me. And I've got two monitors. That's why my face has gone slightly orange on this. Yeah, I know you can't see because I'm sharing the screen. Okay. Okay, great. I'll just give people a minute or two to put some of these down. Yeah, it'd be good if people do have agriculture or GM specific ones. That'd be great to see as well. I think it's sometimes harder to see the ones that you're surrounded by all the time. Frankenfoods, yeah, that's a good one. I haven't seen that as much around as I did before. I've not seen anyone put leveling up yet, which I'm surprised about. That seems to be in the news quite a lot recently. Okay, great. Keep chucking those in. That's brilliant to see. I am just going to go on now to talk a bit about the framework that we are going to be using for the GM Freeze toolkit. But I also wanted to sort of present that in a way that you can take something from this session and use it straight away. So that's the sort of intention in what we're doing. So over the last, I don't know how long actually, it must have been about 3 years. First of all, with a publication I did with Health Poverty Action, which is a toolkit about global justice and solidarity, I started coming up with these framing traps based on animals, because I'd seen a lot of sort of communication traps around, but I thought it was very difficult to understand them without categorizing them in some way. So over the last few years, I've been sort of playing around with the group of animals that got larger and smaller over time. And I've been basically talking about certain communication pitfalls that we can face and matching them to an animal and then giving people a way to get around them. So I'm not going to go into all the animals today, but what is introduce you to a few of the different traps, and then Liz is going to give some examples that came out of the sessions that we did with GM Freeze for each one of them, and these are going to help. They're going to help frame how the toolkit's going to be structured. Give some of the examples of some of the pitfalls to look out for. Sorry, my dog is digging up its bed just behind me. Just run in; it slightly threw me. So we're not going to go through all of these animals. We're just going to go through 3 today. If you want to know a bit more about the animals, with a group called Conservation Optimism, I did a toolkit in which there's a poster that outlines all the different animals. So if you want to go have a look at that, that's quite a good introduction to some of the things we're going to be talking about today. So the first trap I'm going to be talking about is the rat trap, the assumption trap. So basically, not everyone loves rats, but there are a small core of people who really, really do. There's a lot of people who think that rats are a bad thing. You know, you hear all this, you're never more than a meter away from a rat in London or whatever. But they inhabit a space where for some people they're a pest and for some people they're a pet. So if you imagine the 2 circles that I have in the Venn diagram there are people's understanding of the word rat, right? So when I use the term rat, some people might be go, oh, and they might be a much smaller majority, but other people might go, oh, right? And the reason I've called this trap the rat trap or the assumption trap is too often we assume that everyone else has the same associations with the word that we do. And often that's just not the case. Right? There are some things that we talk about that everyone has a very common understanding of. It's never uniform, right? We all have different life experiences, but we all live in the same society or a similar society. And therefore we have a lot of the same ideas, images, news, media, reinforcing what those things are, okay? So if I was to say puppy, a lot more people would go, oh, right, okay? And even those people who don't go, oh, would be like, okay, I understand a puppy is supposed to be a cute thing, right? So they understand when you're talking about something being a puppy or puppy-eyed or whatever, they understand what you're talking about. And this can often refer to jargon or jargon usage, right? So if we say something like CRISPR, we use some term which is technical jargon. Some people, so imagine these 2 circles, right? One is someone working in the field of GM, and one is a person randomly picked on the high street out in Edinburgh where I am, okay? Even though we're all supposed to be social distancing and not wandering around the high street, imagine there's someone there and you've picked them. There's a high chance that one person will be like, okay, I see that's a collection of letters, but I don't know what it is. Is it something to do with crisps? Because that's the closest word that they have. Well, someone else would be like, oh, it's a terrible thing for cutting up genetic material, right? So sometimes when we use jargon, we just end up talking in a way that completely misses the group we're trying to talk to, right? And this is for board game enthusiasts. If there is one other person who recognizes this is just for your benefit. Basically, this is no knowledge, okay? So you spend all your time talking to your colleagues about biodiversity, about agroforestry, about GM. You end up using terms so often that they just become completely normalized, okay? And when they're completely normalized, you don't understand, or you just don't think through the fact that when you talk about it, someone's not going to have the same set of associations and it's not going to mean the same thing to them. And this has several consequences. One, right? Sometimes, like the CRISPR example, people might not understand what you're talking about at all. Other times, people might be able to get to what you're talking about, but the term will be less emotive and less effective in your communications. So basically, the assumption trap is all about like people talk about using plain language the whole time, but this is the reason why. We hardly ever talk about the reason why, or point to the fact that often we're not aware of what actually is plain language because we spend our time surrounded by these things. Just, you know, like biodynamic, or agroforestry, like what do those mean? Like they mean a core thing to a core group of people because they're actually specific terms, but do they mean something to everyone? So what terms should we be using when we talk to everyone else? So my tip for this one is talk to quote unquote normal people. And what I mean by that is just someone who's not working in your organization on the thing you're working on, right? It could be a relative that you phone up. It could be someone else. And when you do phone them up, the most important thing is never to say, I was trying to do this when I came up with this. Just tell them the sentence and see what they say, because any context you give them is stopping their like immediate reaction. So I just wanted people to put some ideas of RAPs. What are some of the sort of terms that you might accidentally use with the public around your different issues in agriculture that maybe you shouldn't do? When I do a full workshop with people, I often try and get people to do a sort of banned list and then come up with some alternatives. So yeah, chuck them in the chat or write them down. Sustainable, that comes up in a lot of workshops that I do. I say 1 in 2 workshops actually. It's still used absolutely loads by everyone though. Permaculture. Permaculture was one that I was going to put on the slide and I couldn't remember the word. So yeah. Agroecology, peatland, great. Yeah, these are great examples. Yeah, excellent. There are lots of these. When you start thinking, and I just think it's so important when you sit down to write something, it's like, especially if you've got a job that goes between policy and communication, that your policy language doesn't sort of taint the rest of your communications. Liz, did you want to tell us about the ones that you found? Oh, you're on mute at the moment.
Rookie error. I do apologise. Yeah, we looked at this one quite a lot, and there's a lot of technical language in GM, and I think it's interesting that Ralph just made that differentiation, because when you're talking about making policy statements, you have to use the correct terminology at least some of the time. What we've got on the slide here is something that I wrote for our newsletter, so I'm shaming myself first. And the headline there, we've got Pest Evolution beats BT crops again. And there is some explanation in the text, but the headline is there and might be read on its own. And, you know, BT crops is an abbreviation. The BT stands in place of Bacillus. I have to look down on my bit of paper for this because I can never remember it. Bacillus thuringiensis cry proteins. Now, you know, that's not normal language. That's not a thing that most people understand. You know, we kind of wrestle with that because these are actually one of the huge classes of GM crops that are in use, and we need to talk about them in terms of what they do. What they actually do is the crops themselves produce a toxin, something that's an insect toxin. So we had a little look, Ralph, if you can move on to the next slide if you're ready.
I'm there.
So, you know, we looked at examples. So instead of saying BT crops, we might occasionally have to say that, but more often we should call them what they are, crops that kill insects. You know, if I was talking to somebody who I expected to have knowledge of pesticides, so in a farming situation, I might refer to them as insecticide crops, but even that is jargon, so you have to know your audience. And I think what we really picked up there was, you know, give it very straight. So we had, you know, we also talked about toxic plants, because again, that is what they're doing. So if anyone's got any alternatives they want to throw in for BT crops, they'd also be very welcome.
Great, thank you, Liz. One really interesting thing is, I don't think I've ever worked with an organization where they haven't agreed that the language should be simpler, but I haven't ever worked with an organization where they don't use too much jargon at the same time. So people know it to be a thing, and unless you give them some sort of tool to examine their own work, I think it's really difficult to realize what you're doing. And I think it's really just important to understand how much, I think the common jargon is, you know, like you're in a bubble, you're being surrounded by people talking the same way. One thing that Liz just reminded me of inadvertently there, which is really important, is these animal traps that I've come up with, they're not mutually exclusive, okay? So it's a way I've come up with categorizing problematic language, but some language can be multiple traps, right? It can be a rat and it can be a parrot and it can be other things. So if you're thinking, oh, actually, you know, when I go on to these other ones, oh, that one's a rat as well, it might be. All of it's arbitrary. It's just a way of trying to organize how we think of things. So the next one I'm going to talk about is the parrot trap, which is another one in which every NGO I've ever worked with has said they don't do it, and then I've read their material and seen they do. So, and I think it's just so easy to do. So let's have a little look at this. So parrots are famous for their repetition. I don't take this photo and I haven't credited it, I just took it off Google. So if you have taken this photo, I really apologize. I think it's very nice. And if I find out who it is, then I will credit them at some point. But the idea of parroting something back, okay, so this is one that Lakoff was really strong on. The idea of not repeating the opposition's frame, because if we remember from the beginning of the talk, repetition is what creates common understanding or common sense, right? So the more times you hear something, even if it's when someone's saying, no, it's not, the more it becomes ingrained in you, right? So this is my one and only impression. So if you just strap yourselves in, get ready for this. This is either the high or low point, depending on your point of view. So Nixon, he famously said, I am not a crook, right? And what did millions of people all over the world think instantly as soon as he said that? They thought, he's a crook, right? Nixon should have said, I am an honest man, right? Because by refuting the thing he was against, he just cemented in people's heads even more, right? So too often we're like, oh, regulation on GM is not red tape, right? When we should be saying, okay, we need more regulation on GM. We shouldn't be saying it's not red tape, because you're just reinforcing the idea of red tape, right? Red tape, it's like red tape, but mispronounced. So just to give you a few examples, I thought highly topical coronavirus one here. No corners were cut in fast approval of Pfizer vaccine, regulators say. So in your mind, automatically, you just think, what corners were cut, right? Rather than we used a safe and speedy procedure, right? Which would have been the thing to say. As soon as you say the thing you're refuting, you just cement it. This is one of my favorites. David Davis, Brexit will not plunge Britain into Mad Max dystopia. What he meant to say was it would be a great success rather than this. Although that, I mean, it looks kind of cool apart from a lot of problems and a lack of water. And then this one from Oxfam, when they were part of that scandal. It's not like we murdered babies, says boss of scandal at Oxfam. Like, that's not a thing you want to be associating your organization with. And lastly, I just wanted to draw your attention to a study. This is a slide that the Public Interest Research Centre, who I worked with for many years and still have a really good association with. I'm associated with the organisation, but I wanted to thank them for being able to use their slide. They have a slide about this study where they were looking at people who were anti-vaccine, which has become topical again now. And they had this thing, a myth buster, right? So I think everyone's heard of a myth buster. You have the myth here, and then you have the truth here, right? And they got people to read those, and then they talked to them again about vaccination. And the thing they found was more people believed the myth after reading the Mythbuster than before, right? And some people actually attributed that myth to the organization who was trying to do the myth busting, right? So when you're doing Mythbusters, you're essentially repeating something harmful or that you don't agree with and reinforcing it in someone's minds before you then give them the true alternative. So there's a question about whether you want to be doing that bit, whether you just want to provide them with the truth instead, okay? So, you know, to put it, you don't want to say it's not unsafe. You want to say it's dangerous, right? So it's all about not reiterating the thing you don't want it to be. So we don't want to repeat something damaging the opposition instead. We want to keep to our key message instead. We want to be saying the things we want to. And I think actually, if you say the thing, just get on the front foot. What is it you really want to be saying? Why are you arguing or debating an issue instead of saying your key point? And you'll see, sadly, I mean, it is really annoying in politics. Some politicians do this, but like to any question, they just say the thing over and over again that they want people to hear, but that's end up what's being quoted. Sorry, I was having a war with my mouth getting these words out at the moment. I'm not sure what's going on. So basically, just say the thing you want to, don't repeat the thing you don't, is the outcome from that one. So can anyone think of any sort of parrots that they've seen recently? If you could put those in the chat, that'd be great. So about your issue or about anything else?
There's an awful lot of chat about vaccines. Just to be really clear, GM Freeze does not work on vaccines in any way, shape or form. We're not going to comment on vaccines. If people want to have a chat about vaccines,
open a can of worms there.
Go for it. But it's not our area of work. There happens to be a very good study on a particular leaflet that was about vaccines, which is why it's useful as an example. Ralph uses it in all his presentations.
Oh yeah, sorry, I do, and it's about comms. It's not about the content. Thanks for that clarification, Liz.
I think for me, one of the interesting things here is that one where you feel like you're not repeating it because you're saying a thing that in grammar terms is the opposite, but it's still got all the same syllables within it. And I think that's a first one to try and lose from your habits of speaking. I have been known to write press quotes that have those in, so like saying imprecise, and then I get the thesaurus out and find an alternative, because it's quite easy to end up doing that. So I think, Ralph, should move on and pick out the example that we'd focus on in some of the GM work?
Sure.
So this slide is taken from a website of an organisation called the New Breeding Techniques Platform. It's actually not, it's still up, it's not actually being used very much anymore. So this is a slightly historic one, but I think it just really demonstrates the thing very, very well. For a long time, when gene editing was very new, this phrase new breeding techniques was very, very widely used. And I have to say I used it. I used it because there's always a debate, should we just meet people on their own terms? Do we have to acknowledge the term that's been used in order to challenge it? But actually it's a nonsense term. It's an entirely managed term. So Ralph, you want to show the next slide? What we should be talking about is experimental new GM techniques, or risky forms of genetic engineering, something else that actually says straight what it is and what we think about it. So again, I think this hooks back to what Ralph was saying, that once you start on this kind of work looking at the animal traps, there's an element of rat in this as well, because it's not entirely clear what new breeding techniques means. It's also fits a few of the other animals, but the biggest thing that we were doing wrong in using it was we were allowing those who are promoting GM to set the agenda. We were repeating a term that we didn't like, and even we were saying things like, these aren't new breeding techniques, they're in fact GM. We shouldn't be saying that at all. We should just say what we're talking about here is experimental new GM techniques, or what we're talking about is risky new forms of genetic engineering. And it's a habit, isn't it? It's about building a different way of structuring your sentences. Exactly.
And I think putting that in the context of like these examples, Liz, it would be saying, even if we say these are not new breeding techniques, they're risky new forms of, like, why are you saying the first one? Because you're just legitimizing that to some extent. So I think wherever possible, we have to keep the repetition to a minimum.
Got some nice ideas coming in there. Do keep them coming.
Okay, and I realise we're doing these at quite a pace. We haven't got that much time, but I thought it'd be nice for you to see a couple of examples rather than just one or two, or just talk to you about the stuff that we've come up with. because I think it gives a better grounding in it. So apologies if this is a bit quick and your like head's already full, but we're only doing one last one. So often when I work my groups, we have to do 10 throughout a day, and their brains have sort of exploded by the end of it. So hopefully we can cope with one more. So and also these are all animals, because I'm a bit obsessed with animals. I did zoology. Animals are awesome. We're animals, which I think is often forgotten. And I've tried not to make them too obscure, and I think maybe anglerfish is one of the more obscure ones, but it was in Finding Nemo, so I think like maybe there is a popular understanding of it. So the anglerfish is the misdirection trap. This trap's a little bit different, maybe slightly more nuanced than the others that we've been introduced to. So anglerfishes live really in the deep, dark depths, and they have this little light on their head, which entices things to come towards them, and then they gobble them up, right? So I use this as the idea of so often communication, especially if we look at the mass media or press or government stuff, it's trying to point us in a certain direction at the expense of something else, okay? So one really important thing of framing, and like if you can take one thing home with you today, I'll probably say this like 4 times about 4 different things, but I'll pretend I haven't, is what is left out is just as important as what is in the message, okay? So what is absent is often just as important what's there. So when we frame a message, we're drawing attention to something. So also, as a complete aside, anglerfish, the males are basically just like a sack of sperm. They go into the female and they just get absorbed by her, and that's their entire point of their existence. Fun anglerfish fact. Sorry, I know that's not really about communication, but I think it's amazing. Right. So one thing I've worked a lot on in conservation is I'm often faced with this really sort of racist depiction of poaching. Okay, so there's this whole thing of like, you know, these evil people killing these rhinos, right? And there's a war going on, and we have to arm one group against these other. And often there are poor black individuals who are like put up as the criminal or the villain in a piece. And while I'm not condoning poaching in any way, I think what's really interesting is who's buying the product and who's profiting from it are often completely absent, okay? And if we were to focus on those, maybe the whole idea of how we address poaching would change. Instead of militarizing the national parks, maybe there'd be something about stopping the trade, or, you know, some actions have been taken on that, but the large focus is on that one thing. So one really important element to point out is whatever we focus on, like that also ends up influencing the solutions that we come up with. So how we describe a problem describes the solution as well. So what I really encourage you to do is go have a look at a load of news headlines after this and see what's missing. What other things could they be talking about? Which other characters could be involved, or how could the message be switched? And how would that tell you a very different story? So like personal responsibility is really important to me in doing environmental change, being part of environmental change. But I think too often there's too much emphasis put on individuals. So I'm not anti-Keep Cup, I've got one, don't worry about that. It's illustrative as an example, right? But I think a lot of environmental campaigning has been about, you know, don't use a straw yourself, rather than let's ban the manufacture of plastic fishing nets and regulate their use so they're not dumped in the sea, right? So as individuals, we all have a part to play, but too often the role of governments and corporations is absent from that, and all the emphasis is put on individuals. So in terms of misdirection, that's, you know, we have to just carry on consuming and make the right choices. Only certain rich individuals can consume the correct things, right? I just wanted to show you this example of how to switch around the frame, which I really, really love. It's funny, clever, and really informative. It's from an Australian project about rehoming dogs. And basically, instead of using the normal framing of a poor, helpless animal looking really down and as a victim, they spun it round, they changed the focus, and they changed the direction of what was happening, and they put it on individuals. So they did a project where they went and met people who were working in offices. That seems a bit weird now, but like large number of people working in offices in an Australian city. They gave them an option at lunchtime to go for a walk with dogs. So in this, they framed the message so that the dog was doing the helping action, and they were freeing people from their tiny boxes, which are cubicles in which they sit in offices. So this one's really about experimenting with focus. So often we look at problems the same way over and over again. So for example, I used to work in water policy at RSPB, and so often we looked at this idea of, we talked about diffuse pollution rather than point source, right? And as soon as you talked about it as diffuse, it seemed like the problem was impossible to deal with because it was everywhere, right? Rather than the fact that it's some individual farmers taking actions which collectively has a problem, but using that terminology made addressing it seem more difficult. So we've really got to experiment with changing the focus in different ways. This is a kind of harder one to give examples of in the chat, but if you can think of them, by all means do. But I just want you to think of areas where, like, whenever you're talking about a problem and whatever your specific work area is, how you choose to frame it and who you choose to talk about, and how could that be different? You know, like if you're always talking about farmers, maybe how would it be different if you talked about the public? If you always talking about supermarkets, how would it be different if you talked about government, right? If you're always talking about government, how would your message be different if you talked about multinational corporations who were, well, if you were talking about agribusiness? So switching it round really changes the nature of the message.
Okay, Ralph, shall I come in here with the?
Yeah, go for it. Do you want me to go on the slide?
Pop the next slide up.
Yeah.
So one of the issues that gets discussed a lot with newer GM techniques is precision. And there's vast amounts of debate about precision. You know, we've got an image here that I have used. I've used this image lots of times, and because, you know, it's lovely. It's from a photo library. It was cheap, and it's got nice colours, and it shows, you know, it shows somebody going in with a pair of very fine scissors, getting exactly the little tiny bit of DNA that they want, and moving it around. And this is incredibly common as a set of imagery. It's well, we're going to talk about metaphors in a bit, and it comes up there again. But I think this really, I think the anglerfish here, the misdirection, is talking about precision. And the reason, you know, there's lots of reasons for that. One is that something can be precise but not accurate. A stopped clock is extremely precise, but it's only accurate twice a day or once if it's digital and 24-hour clock. So, you know, being precise is completely irrelevant to whether or not it's accurate. And it's also not relevant to how impactful changes in DNA are or can be. There are many, you know, known health conditions in humans that are caused by a single nucleotide base pair change. Now that's me using a lot of jargon, but the smallest unit of genetic molecules that you can get, you can have one change at that smallest possible unit, can cause hugely impactful diseases like sickle cell anemia is one of the examples. So, you know, it's actually not relevant whether it's tiny or whether it's precise. It's irrelevant whether it's accurate. It's relevant what impact it has. So I think we get drawn into this discussion about precision all the time, and we often end up going back and using that parrot trap, and we'll say, oh yeah, but it's not as precise as they say. And actually we shouldn't, you know, unless we're really called upon to do that, we probably shouldn't talk about it at all. What we should do, and if you want to show the, I think the next slide just says don't talk about it, but you know, talk about what we want to talk about. Yeah, don't get drawn in to a discussion about precision with this example. So don't engage, discuss other aspects of what's wrong with it. So we might, instead of talking about the precision, talk about the unintended consequences of any genetic modification. We could talk about patenting. We could talk about the fact that the first example of a gene edited crop, the only one that's actually being grown anywhere, is one of those weed killer friendly oilseed rape crops that are exactly the same as the original GM crops. So we could talk about how it's used. Precision isn't relevant, so we shouldn't be talking about it unless we're absolutely forced to.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to stop talking about the animals just to reiterate what they were to finish. So first of all, we had the rat, which is the assumption trap, which is about trying to understand a bit better what is in your audience's head in terms of the associations they make about something, and not to use terms that mean something to you but doesn't mean anything to them. Okay, so that was that. The second one was the parrot trap. So it's not to repeat an oppositional frame. So don't say this regulation is not red tape. Instead say this regulation is much needed, right? And the third one is just more general about understanding that it's the misdirection trap, the angler trap. It's about anglerfish trap. It's about understanding that what's left out is as important as what's put in. So where you put the focus really influences how your message will be received. Okay, so another element that we spent some time on during the workshops, and Liz is going to talk about a bit in the toolkit, is metaphor. So I wanted to give a really quick introduction to this, and again give you a go at doing something. And when I'm talking about metaphor, I'm talking about it in the broadest possible terms. I'm not talking about it in the English literature sense. I'm talking about whenever we evoke any sort of imagery in people's heads. So we're making some analogy or comparison in some way. So don't get caught up about whether something's a synonym or a metaphor. It's basically the use of imagery in words. So one study I've talked quite a lot about over the years, and I learned about while I was at the Public Interest Research Centre, was one about framing crime. And in this study, they got a load of people, they asked them their opinions about crime, and then they got them to read a paragraph which frames crime either as, this is why I hate Zoom. I used to spend my time like doing a mime of a monster around a room, and I can't really, rah, it's not the same. If you could just imagine that, that'd be great. So a rampaging beast, like rah, smash the screen, rah, right? And then a virus, okay, something we've all become incredibly familiar with now. So paragraph, only one word change to beast or virus. Then they talk to people about how they felt about those things again. And one interesting thing was that basically, if you talked about crime as a beast, people wanted more punitive measures. People wanted people locked up, right? So if you talk about crime as a beast, people think of that individual as other. So there's another trap and some other stuff I talk about, but in terms of othering, right, making someone seem less human, right? It's not your friends or family that are criminals. It's this other group, right, that are like less human or less like you, right? So when you talk about crime as a beast, and if you look at our tabloid newspapers in the UK at least, we often use this framing, showing my age, people like Raoul Moat or whatever, you know, like there was never any attempt to understand individuals, just to condemn them, right, as these sort of animals. So when you use that framing, that's the response you get. When you talk about virus, people wanted more rehabilitation, right? They wanted measures to stop crime at its cause and to rehabilitate people rather than punitive measures. And this is the idea that actually anyone else could get a virus, right? It's not just these other people, it could be your friends and families who are criminals, right? So really important thing is that metaphor changes our response. The way we describe it really changes people's response to it. And there's one group, Frameworks, have done a lot on this. They originally did a lot of, the Frameworks Institute, they did a lot of work in the United States, and they've actually got a UK organization as well. So Framing the Economy was a collaboration between NEON, the New Economics Organizers Network, the New Economics Foundation, Frameworks Institute, and PERC. I was working on some of the field work while I was there. I didn't have anything to do with writing it, the Public Interest Research Centre. Basically, we went around interviewing people to see how they understood the economy. And one amazing thing we found from that is that people didn't, right? It's a sort of black box. And I think if you like get to grips with that, like people don't really understand how the economy works, yet it's probably half of all our news. You know, I used to think I was the only one that didn't know whether the FTSE going up or down, or, you know, like didn't understand what that was about, or interest rates, or like hardly anyone has a mental model, right? A way of describing it in their head. It's just not present. So one of the things we tried to do with framing the economy, well, the other people who were doing it tried to do with framing the economy, was to come up with a metaphor to describe how the economy works and how we could create a fairer economy that served everyone better, right? So one interesting thing that came from this study is they tested a couple of metaphors, and one they found that didn't work was a sort of natural metaphor, right? If we're talking about the economy being something that grows or whatever, people didn't think that could be controlled, right? They seemed that it was inevitable. Basically, it drove fatalism in people. If you talk about used a natural metaphor with regards to the economics, right? That's not necessarily a bad thing for other stuff. If you're talking about a movement of people, you might want to talk about it growing or use natural metaphors, because it being inevitable in terms of its growth is a good thing. But if you want to change something, it wasn't. So the metaphor that they did use was a computer program, right? So the economy is a computer program. We just need to change the software so it delivers more to more people, right? And that worked as a mental model to people. There's enough films throughout the 80s, and you know, when someone like hacks into NASA and changes things, so people understood there's a possibility of change, right? So it's really important that your metaphors allow some element for people to change things if that's what you're trying to do, right? So that's one interesting one. Just to show how this metaphor was used in action. So this is from the publication. Our economy is like a computer program that's constantly revised, updated. Corporate elites have gained the password to the economy and programmed the economy for corporate interests. You don't have to read it all. I just think it's a nice example. Like sometimes this stuff can seem a bit abstract unless you have a written example of how the metaphor is used. If you're interested in this, really go Google Framing the Economy and have a look at the report. It's great. And then just more sort of environment focused, the Frameworks Institute did one where they were talking about the ocean, and they found a good metaphor to use was like human health, right? So to think of the ocean as like a human body, right? And that it has different, like parts of it are like different parts, different organs, and they all need to be functioning for it to be functioning well. So that's another one to go look at, another report that's worth seeing. So this is, I've often found this quite a hard one. I don't know if people have heard, I think it's an adaptation of some native story, but there's a version of it by David Foster Wallace, and he's talking about an old fish going along a stream and two young fish go past him. And he's like, how's the water today, folks? And they're like, what's water, right? And metaphors are kind of like that. You're surrounded by them the entire time, so you don't even know they're there. And like when I've been doing workshops, I'll say to someone, you know, have you thought of any metaphors? No, I'm really blocked. I can't think of anything, or, you know, nothing's flowing now. And you're like, oh, you're talking in metaphor, like they're all there. So can anyone think of any metaphors that are used in agriculture that you use, or in your specific work area? I'm not sure like where everyone's positioned, but in farming or any related topics. If you could chuck them in the chat, that'd be excellent. Or even just have a think about them. Motherhood, Mother Nature's an oft used one. I've often heard stewards of the countryside as well, is one that I've heard a lot with regard to agriculture. Husbandry, yeah, there's Three Sisters, yeah. Toolkits, yeah, they were swimming them. I've used them quite a lot. I've no idea how many I've used in this presentation. I've mixed them quite a lot. It's quite interesting. Someone picked up on my use of the term neoliberalism, which is obviously a terrible rap that I shouldn't be using, and shows how much time I spend chatting to people about that thing. Custodian, yeah. And one of the things that, before Liz goes on to give her example, one of the things that we did during the workshops is I've sort of come up with the tool, which is a sort of series of questions that we can ask, because basically like reports like Frame the Economy are absolutely excellent, but there's a lot of money that goes into the testing of that, and I think that's great. If you've got the resources available, it's always better to test your metaphors. I think that's a really good way of doing it. But if you haven't, you have to work out whether the metaphor you're using is any good or has any sort of potential problems with it. So we sort of used a number of questions to kind of test and interrogate the metaphors we're using, like who are the actors involved, and does this metaphor allow change to happen? If that's something, you know, like if we're trying to stop something happening, does this metaphor now allow that to happen, or does it drive fatalism and make something seem inevitable? Liz, do you want to talk to us a little bit about the metaphors? I think you kind of alluded to them earlier.
Yes, I think as we sort of touched on that. So the first one here, if you think more of the words here rather than the image, this is quite a mixed, there's kind of two metaphors going on at once. But what I wanted to pull out of the example here is that those words cut and paste. And we see, this is a metaphor that we see a lot in talking about GM. Interestingly, it used to get used for older forms of GM, where DNA from other species are brought into a crop. They're the ones that are actually, you know, still in production around the world. We're now seeing it more used for these newer gene editing techniques that are, you know, are, what did we say before, risky new ways of changing DNA. And what they're based on is the idea of text editing. The metaphor is text editing, which is something that we all do, that happens really easily. You know, in our word processors, cut and paste is just a couple of clicks. It's very simple. It's something that we can all do very easily. And I think that's really, really widely used in GM. And, you know, it's quite, I'm sure we've all used it, but what it does is massively oversimplify the issues and make it seem very accessible and safe. Ralph, you want to show the next one? So, sorry, you won't be able to read all the text. This is just taken from a website. But what I'm really interested in here is the use of surgical tweezers to put the little bit of DNA into the double helix. And you see that the hand is gloved. And how I view that is that that's trying to present DNA as surgery. And people don't ever say, oh, you know, we do an operation, or they don't even say surgical precision, which is interesting. But they do use language around precision, and a huge amount of the imagery is presented as if it's surgery. It gives the impression that they somehow can see the DNA and they go and they pick it up and they move it. And of course, it's not like that at all. It's all, you know, test tubes with 16 different chemical reagents going in and all sorts of stuff getting shaken up and hoping that you get to the right place. So, you know, this imagery, which kind of gives us the impression that DNA is not only, again, the simplicity. Oh, thank you, Angela. Surgeons don't call them tweezers, they call them forceps. Thank you. As you can see, I have no surgical training whatsoever. And thankfully, very little experience of it. But, you know, it's probably, the image probably doesn't look like something that someone who works in a hospital theatre would recognise, but it gives the impression, it gives that feeling of it all being trustworthy. You know, and it's definitely going to go right because they've got those gloves on, and they, you know, it's all the colours as well. There's a lot of blue, a lot of, you know, sort of surgical clean colours.
I think that's sorry, I was just going to say it's really important that imagery, like all this framing and messaging advice, it equally applies to imagery, to words, to experiences. Like places themselves are frames. You know, the Houses of Parliament all being gold and red, like. That's a frame in itself, and I think this is a really good example of that, Liz. Sorry to cut in, but I just don't think I'd made that. You know, I use the words because they're easier in terms of people learning the stuff, but actually equally all of this can apply to images. Sorry, thank you.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think that's 100%. And, you know, equally the use of images of people in white coats, and now that can go either way. You know, a lot of other stuff is going on there, but, you know, there is an effort there to tie into imagery that people feel safe with. there's a comment in the chat, trust us, we're doctors. And I hadn't thought of the NHS logo blue, but there is something about the way that people respond to blue. It is clean. And in certain situations, it's there here, Pat's got it, cool, calm, in control, absolutely, 100%. So, you know, the way that we use images is really key. Now, Ralph, did we get the next slide on? We had a slight technical hitch with our slides. No, we didn't. Okay.
I don't know. It was my ineptitude, not a slight technical hitch. But...
I'm giving you the get out there, but thank you, Ralph, for your honesty. The third one that I pulled out as an example, and these are by no means the only metaphors that we see in GM, but the other one that we see a lot is tools in the toolbox. And that's constantly used. Oh, we need all the tools in the toolbox. And you know what that implies is that GM of any kind can just be used alongside any other kind of farming, that things aren't in any way interconnected, that you can just, you know, grab a bit of GM, you can have that in that field over there, and you can have your organic something else just right next door. And of course that's not true. We're all working with a system, you know, we've got issues of contamination, and I think the other thing that the tools in the toolbox metaphor does is it implies that it's people who have concerns about GM who are taking something away from those who want to use it. Whereas in fact, this is brand new. This is about adding something that completely changes the way that the whole farming system works. It's about, it changes the power dynamics, it changes who controls the food. So it's not, it's not here. It doesn't, you know, it's not in the UK in our fields already. So by saying tools in the toolbox, you imply that they can all mix up together, that they're all of equal status, and that, you know, you can chop and change from one to the other, but also that it's already there. So this thing that Ralph was talking about earlier with the money, it's implying that we're taking away from farmers something that they already have, which is of course nonsense from it, you know, in the UK context. So I think we're getting some interesting stuff in the chat that I wasn't following it while I was talking. But Ralph, I think we've got time to see if anybody wants to just throw in some ideas. There are some ideas that we're playing with, so we can either just see what people want to chip in, or I could put forward the ideas we're playing with and get some responses.
I think it's a good idea. Like if people have got some alternatives to the scissors or the clinical model, you know, like if we shouldn't be describing it as that, and we should be describing it as possibly something less accurate or reckless or dangerous, what metaphor might we want to use?
And you know, if it's not going to put people off too much, there's some great stuff coming in already. One of the things that I have quite recently learned from Ralph, or realised through the discussion we've been having with him, is that even in developing our own metaphors, what I was tending to do was try and slightly change the metaphors that we had. So, you know, thinking of cut and paste, was saying, well, you know, it's not really like cut and paste, it's more like predictive text. And you know, that made a lot of sense in my brain. But actually, predictive text is kind of annoying and a bit silly, but it's not doing any kind of massive harm in the world, and it's still in that framing that it's like text. And actually, we need to be much bolder. I'm intrigued by the cookie cutter. Cookie cutters come up a couple of times.
And also, I think someone's that where you wear the oven gloves and try and use the fork to get frozen chocolate cut up. I have played that once actually.
I think I missed that bit. I'm not sure I'm understanding that bit.
So it's a game where you, I think it's maybe a bit of a rant. Not everyone's played that game, but you know, if you've got time in lockdown, get some oven gloves and a bar of chocolate, and then try and cut up some chocolate.
It sounds great round Ralph's house, doesn't it?
I haven't played it, but I mean here. I have played it before though. Why do I need to clarify that? Sorry, everyone.
So I think we've got some stuff. Oh, thank you, Saskia. She's enjoying the humour. I have to. I think it's easier for us to work together if we can all enjoy each other's company. So I hope nobody's offended by us being a little a little light-hearted at times. You know, the topic is serious, but we are human beings. So I think we've got some good stuff coming in. Shall I throw in the ones that we've been working on just to get some sort of reactions? I can't honestly remember if we had a slide on this or not, Ralph, but you can see.
No,
no. Okay.
Well, we might have, again, it would have been my failure if we haven't. But fine.
So the three that I've got, you know, this is the bit that I'm still working on, and the reason you don't have your lovely guide yet is thinking about these alternative metaphors. And that part of the reason for that is that I have learned along the way with this project that I need to be bolder and go further than I went into it thinking. And three that I'm kind of toying with are gambling. So there you might say something like, you know, this is playing roulette with our food, or playing roulette with the health of our soils, something like that. So that's gambling as one option. A second option is vandalism. We had something up about a chainsaw, I think, earlier. You might also say something like taking a wrecking ball to nature. Now, I know wrecking balls aren't quite vandalism, so that's not quite right, but it's the idea of violence, of kind of presenting genetic modification as something that is very disruptive and is going to do, you know, not be precise and surgical. And then the third one, which relates a bit to the sort of violence vandalism idea, is injury. So this is potentially getting into a wrap, but CRISPR is a particular tool within this gene editing stuff, the newer GM techniques. It's had a lot of attention because the people who did work on it won a Nobel Prize. It's one of the things that's referred to as the genetic scissors. But actually what we could say, if we have to talk about the detail, is that CRISPR creates a DNA wound. So instead of saying it's the DNA scissors that opens up the double helix and allows amazing things to happen, if we describe it as creating a DNA wound that the cell is then trying to repair, we're creating a very different frame around it. It's something much more negative.
Right.
So I'm going to let some comments come in here.
I think an interesting one, Liz, with the gambling one is like, what is being gambled? I think there's something in the narrative about something that belongs to everyone, that's in the public, is being gambled with. It's not the individual's capital, right? It's a common good that someone else is gambling with for profit.
Yeah, I think that might be where we've not quite caught it yet. If anyone's got any, there is a comment there about gambling, focuses on the uncertainty, keeps the people who are doing it out of the frame. Yeah, I mean, part of what I liked about the gambling was the idea of, you know, the casino owner, that, you know, the casino always wins, the house always wins. So, you know, if it's not putting the blame on the farmers, it's putting the blame on the companies that are running things. So is this idea of an overarching entity that's making the money and on the back of other people's pain.
And I think one other thing is, like, if you're trying to, like, what is the motivation, who's profiting from this? But the other thing is, like, what is the, someone did mention positive thinking in the chat, and it's made me think about, like, what's the alternative narrative? Like, what is the way in which, like, we don't want to get into a debate about whether GM is going to feed the world or not, but what is the positive way in which the world is going to be fed? What's our narrative and our metaphor for that, about the thing that we support and want to happen, rather than the thing we're against? Because I think the other thing that's so difficult is, so often it's a bit like akin to the parrot, right? We're often on the back foot and we're talking, we don't want this thing, rather than what is the future that we do want, right? And I think that's really a really important element, and really important in terms of what the metaphor feeds as well. What is the best option that we're going for? What is the better future that we want that doesn't have GM, and what does it have instead? Sorry, a nice easy question, you know, for the afternoon.
You can all just answer that in the next 3 minutes. That'll be fine. I think this idea where what we talk about GM fits into what we talk about alternatives is quite complex as well, because What we have in the UK is a small number of very small specialist organisations. So Pat's from Beyond GM, I'm from GM Freeze. There's one or two other very tiny organisations. We're all kind of like 2 people, and as in, sorry, 2 people each, not 2 between us. It's not just me and Pat, but you know, there's a very small group of people working full time on these issues, or nearly full time on these issues, and so we're talking about GM and what's wrong with it all the time. And many of the people we're trying to work with are talking about the solutions, and that's great. But GM can fall through the gaps, you know, particularly with this all the tools in the box thing. So we need to make those connections. And I'm really hoping that some of what we can do by sharing some messaging is make it easier for people who are very focused on the solutions to talk about why GM isn't part of it, you know, to not have it hived off, because there is such a strong government agenda in the UK at the moment. That agenda is only really able to cover England, but it could also impact the devolved nations as well. So, you know, we have to pull together and find ways to work around this. Sorry, I was slightly distracted by a comment there about a Russian. I'm not sure what that was about.
So Liz, did you want to talk a little bit about like where we go now then?
Yes, yes, if that's okay. We've still got some great ideas coming through, so keep them coming. Just to let you know, the toolkit will be, you know, completed over sort of the next several weeks. I have to say this would have been what I was focusing on entirely had the government not decided to launch a massive consultation right like last week. So I don't have a specific date, but there's a website that we put in the chat earlier. I'm wondering if our Bella's on the case, she's going to put it in the chat for us. So we've got a page up on the GM Freeze website already where our toolkit is going to be, and that is open to everybody. If anybody has come along as a spy for the other side, you're very welcome. I'm extremely flattered. You know, we're going to keep all this stuff open because what matters is that we all keep talking and keep working together. I really welcome contributions. You know, we're particularly on this metaphors issue, so you know, finding other metaphors, testing them out. So you know, feel free to just email me. My email is very widely available, but it's very simple: liz@gmfreeze.org. So you know, drop me a line if you've got other stuff that you want to contribute. Just give the funder another quick name check. This has all been made possible by the Network for Social Change. GM Freeze works on an absolute shoestring, so we can only do projects like this with additional funding. So, you know, really, really appreciative of them. And yeah, and all of you for coming. It's fantastic. I'm actually just going to quickly answer a question before I say we'll be open for questions, because it's easy. Andy Johnson does freeze indicate a pause until what? The name of my organisation has been around for quite a long time. It reflects the fact that originally the campaign was for what was called the 5-year freeze, which was a 5-year moratorium on the use of GM in UK food and farming. We're an umbrella organisation, so some of our members would say there is absolutely no way GM could ever happen, ever be right with them. There are others who have a very clear idea of what they would support and when and how. So freeze, moratorium, not this, not right now, is our common ground. So that's where that name comes from. I hope that helps. So yeah, we've got time. We've done it. We've got time for questions.
Woo! Well done, us.
I know that Bella and Pat were both looking at questions, and mostly we've had brilliant comments and brilliant contributions, which is fabulous. If anyone has specific questions, oh, you're all being lovely in the chat. I'm going to start blushing.
I already have. I think I'm not breathing enough.
Yeah, it would be great to have any questions. Oh, that's lovely. We've elevated mood. That is good. We all need that right now. Boring question, not boring at all, from Kate. Do we know what's happening in Wales? Sort of. We've got a few helpful contacts in Wales, but I think it would be really, really helpful to have as many organisations in Wales engaged in this this consultation as possible, and the same in Scotland and Northern Ireland. The consultation that's going on and the lead from Westminster is very strongly pro, particularly the newer, more experimental forms of GM, but pro GM at all. Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland are they are technically in charge of food and farming policy in their territory, but the way all of that works under the various Brexit bills is really quite complicated. Our newsletter is out actually later this week, and I've done a story on that made me go cross-eyed trying to work through it. So although this consultation about deregulating gene editing can only apply to England, because that's all that Westminster can do, it's incredibly important that people in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland take part and indicate that if England was to deregulate, it would have a huge impact on the devolved nations. I'm sorry, that is a very detailed answer, but as it came up as a proper question, I went for it.
There was another question I just noticed, Liz, if you could answer, which was just saying, like, what is the guide specifically for? Someone said, are you going to offer any guidance on replying to the DEFRA consultation, which I'm not sure you will, but like just being a bit clear about what the guide is about and who it's for?
Yes, that's an excellent point. I think there's two different things. Both Beyond GM and GM Freeze will absolutely offer guidance on replying to the DEFRA consultation, and we'll do that very soon. We'll get some basics out soon, and we'll probably add to it over time. We're also really, really happy to engage with and talk to any particular group. So if you're part of any specialist group and want to hold a workshop or a discussion, then get in touch with myself or Pat. We're very much up for it and open to doing that kind of stuff. Again, another quick funder plug. We received some money through the Farming the Future Fund, so to specifically work together on a bunch of issues, and thankfully we'd seen that this was probably coming and we were able to get it in there. So for once in our lives, we have project funding for a thing that came up urgently. The guide that this workshop is about, and that the project that this is all part of, is much more long-term thinking. This is much more about how we all talk about GM all the time. In my perfect world, I would have done it 6 months before the consultation, so that we would all be responding to the consultation really naturally with our brilliant new metaphors and our, complete lack of animal traps. Unfortunately, I don't rule the world and haven't been able to get everything in the order that I want it. So there's a parallel and there's a crossover, but the specific guidance on this consultation will come much sooner and be developed, and then as a separate thing. There's going to be guidance really for talking about GM in any context, so it's quite a broad thing. It won't be massive though. I'm a very big fan of a tight guide, and then we'll put some more detail elsewhere for people who want it, so you won't have to spend hours reading, I promise. Now there's something I feel like all this reframing will be so much harder to do if the COVID vaccine works well, because they use gene editing techniques. Any thoughts on that? That's from Charlotte. I think that's a really interesting question. I actually, from the minute that all this COVID stuff started, anticipated that there would be a, GM would solve all this kind of PR. I've actually seen far less of it than I expected. And I think, there is a risk. My answer to it from GM Freeze is that medical use of genetic technology and use in food and farming are completely separate. They're subject to very, very different regulation. And even with a mass vaccination programme, people give informed consent to an individual interaction with a medical professional. With our food, we all eat, some of us many times every day, particularly me, and what's grown in a field is out there in the environment. So it's much, much more open than any kind of medical use. So I hope that covers that one.
I think those are really good, powerful, clear points. I think, again, having some metaphor to back that up might be really nice. But I think, like, you've definitely got a really nice, tight argument there. I just think it's having the room to be able to make it is the problem, right? Like, I think in any debate that is really coherent, but where do you get the space to get that heard? And my concern about being able to address that is probably the strength of the voice and and the spheres in which you get to counter those. So I think as a counter narrative, that's great. And I think it's one of the things we haven't mentioned at all is, like, communications isn't just about psychology, words, images. It's also about power. And having the power to get the message out. Like, I think that's one reason why it's incredibly important to have a coherent narrative from the whole of the sides that are arguing for a certain point of view. But I think the feasibility of getting that out would be, like, one of the issues as well that you can't really ignore. I'm not trying to put it down on it at all. I think it's something we can think about doing, and I think it's really heartening to see how clear the message is, because I think that's, it's really good.
But it's interesting because it is a message that I'm used to giving, but only in response to questions. And actually, we probably should be being proactive, and a metaphor there might be really helpful. I'm going to take us right to the wire time-wise, unless Bella tells me off for it. There's a question that I think Pat might want to answer, which is, have you ever been involved in a debate that involves people with various views and expertise on GM, one where both sides take an open-minded approach and actively listen to each other?
Very quickly, yes. Beyond GM has been involved for the last 3 years in an initiative called Bigger Conversation, where we have roundtables and world cafes and Zooms, particularly during lockdown, with people from all sides of the debate. And one of the things that we've noticed is that the argument at this sort of PR lobbying level is far more unreasonable than at the plant breeding level, where you have people who are involved day to day, who not one that we've ever spoken to says we should completely deregulate GM. The landscape is how we might regulate it and what's fair for everybody. And so we've produced a couple of reports which you can get on the Bigger Conversation website. It's just www.abiggerconversation.org. I did post it in the chat here. And those represent the kind of the state of the discussion between differing points of view right now as it's happening. And we're going to that initiative has been extended for another 3 years, so we're going to keep doing that. So watch this space.
Right, more props to far-sighted funders. Well, listen, we're on time, and I know that the conference are trying to be really tight on time because there's a lot of things happening. Bella, do you have any leaving instructions for anybody, or?
No, not at the moment. Just to say that if you kind of wanted to continue this conversation, or share any of your contact details with each other, you can head to the RFC Padlet, which I can post another link to now.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, that's great. And do find. I'm gonna say Pat as well. I think Pat and I are both very open to people contacting us about the consultation or framing more generally. And I understand the recording is going to be on YouTube at some point. So hopefully, as you're registered at the conference, you will get all that news from them with their technical wizardry. So thank you. That you've been really, really participative and enthusiastic and smiley and engaged, and it's lovely. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I just dropped my website in because I forgot. I'm not organised as Liz. Thanks.